The morning frost clung to Deputy Warren Thatcher's boots as he pushed through the dense Oregon pines, following the frantic gestures of Dale Kirkwood, a local deer hunter whose face had gone the color of old parchment. It was October 17, 1963, and the Ochoco National Forest near Dayville smelled of wet earth and decay. "Right there, Warren. God help me. Right there," Dale stammered, pointing toward a shallow depression beneath a rotting Douglas fir. What Warren saw would haunt his dreams for the remainder of his life. A human hand, skeletal and pale, protruded from the disturbed soil like some obscene plant reaching for sunlight. The flesh had mostly deteriorated, but scraps of a floral print dress clung to the bones. As Warren knelt closer, his flashlight caught something else, a glint of metal, a locket, and beside it, partially buried, the corner of a black-and-white photograph. Warren's hands trembled as he radioed Sheriff Mervyn Dowsett. What they didn't know yet was that this discovery would unravel 7 years of carefully concealed horror, leading them to a couple whose cultured smiles masked something profoundly inhuman. 7 years earlier, Eugene, Oregon, spring, 1956. Elowen Ashford first met Thorvald Crawford at a university lecture on existential philosophy at the University of Oregon. She was 28, thin as a whisper, with prematurely silver-streaked auburn hair that she wore in a severe bun. Her pale green eyes held an intensity that most people found uncomfortable, as if she were perpetually calculating the weight of their souls and finding them wanting. Thorvald, who insisted everyone call him Thor, sat 3 rows behind her, a broad-shouldered man of 32 with Norwegian features, sharp cheekbones, ice-blue eyes, and hair so blonde it was nearly white. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an academic air, though his hands were calloused from years of carpentry work before he'd reinvented himself as a freelance photographer. Professor Edmund Hartley was discussing Sartre's concept of the other when Elowen turned around, fixing Thor with that unnerving stare. Later, she would tell him she'd recognized something in him immediately, a kindred absence where most people kept their moral compass. They met for coffee at a dingy establishment near campus. The conversation began with philosophy, but quickly descended into darker waters. "People are obsessed with meaning," Elowen said, stirring her black coffee methodically. "They construct elaborate narratives to convince themselves their existence matters. But the truth? Most people are utterly forgettable. They live, they die, and within a generation, it's as if they never existed at all." Thor leaned back, studying her with open fascination. "You're talking about the truly alone ones, the drifters, the unwanted." "Exactly." Her eyes brightened. "Society's margins are full of ghosts who are already halfway to oblivion. No families, no connections. They stumble through life, and when they vanish, nobody notices. Nobody mourns." "It's almost merciful," Thor said quietly, testing the waters, "to give their meaningless lives some purpose, even if that purpose is—" "Preservation," Elowen finished. "To document them, to prove they existed, to collect their forgotten stories before the world erases them completely." A long silence stretched between them. The coffee shop's radio played Perry Como, cheerful and oblivious. Finally, Thor reached across the table and took her hand. His grip was firm, warm, alive. "I think we understand each other, Elowen." They married 6 weeks later in a quiet courthouse ceremony. No guests, no family. They told the justice of the peace they were photographers embarking on a cross-country documentary project. It wasn't entirely a lie. Their apartment in Eugene became a planning headquarters. Thor had legitimate credentials as a freelance photographer. He'd sold several pieces to regional magazines and had accumulated professional equipment. Elowen, who'd studied anthropology before dropping out, crafted their cover story with meticulous care. They would pose as photographers working on a long-term project documenting America's forgotten folk, the elderly, the isolated, the overlooked citizens of small-town America. They even created fake letterhead claiming affiliation with National Geographic, though they were careful never to use it in ways that could be easily verified. "The key," Elowen explained one evening, spreading maps across their kitchen table, "is to target the truly invisible, people who've outlived their families, widows and widowers with no children, migrants who've settled in places where nobody knows their history." Thor traced a finger along the remote towns of eastern Oregon: Milton Freewater, Joseph, Prairie City, Fossil, Antelope, Mitchell. These places are perfect. Weeks can pass before anyone notices someone's missing. And by then, we'll be 3 towns away. "We'll need a system," Elowen said, "a ritual. Something that gives it meaning beyond the act itself." They developed their method over months of discussion. First, identify the target through careful observation and conversation with locals. Second, approach with their cover story, offering to photograph the person and record their life story for posterity. Third, conduct an extensive interview and photo session, building trust. Fourth, offer poisoned coffee, a carefully measured dose of secobarbital mixed with brandy, enough to render the victim unconscious but not immediately lethal. Fifth, manual strangulation while unconscious, clean, quiet, leaving minimal evidence. Sixth, transport the body to a pre-selected burial site in national forest land. Seventh, and most important to Elowen, preserve the photographs and one meaningful personal item from each victim in their collection. "They'll be remembered," Elowen whispered, arranging the hypothetical trophies in her mind. "Not by the world, perhaps, but by us. We'll be the keepers of their stories, the only proof they ever mattered." Thor looked at his wife with something approaching reverence. Most men would have seen madness in her eyes. He saw purpose. They purchased a 1954 Ford panel van, painting it a nondescript beige and installing custom storage compartments. Thor built a false floor that could conceal a body if necessary. They stocked it with photographic equipment, camping gear, and the tools of their true trade: rope, tarps, shovels, quicklime. In the van's rear, hidden behind a locked panel, they created their shrine, a small space lined with black velvet where they would display their collection. Photographs mounted on boards, each accompanied by a single item: a watch, a ring, a letter, a small personal treasure. Proof of existence, proof of their power over memory itself. "Are you frightened?" Thor asked the night before they embarked on their first hunt. Elowen's smile was serene, almost beatific. "No. Are you?" "No." He pulled her close. "I feel purposeful, for the first time in my life." "So do I." They left Eugene on May 3, 1957, heading east toward the Columbia River Plateau and the small town of Milton Freewater. In the van's glove compartment, Elowen kept a leather-bound journal where she would record each acquisition in her precise, spidery handwriting. The first page was already inscribed with a quote from Nietzsche that she'd modified for their purposes: "We are the artists of oblivion, and these forgotten souls are our canvas." The collectors of oblivion were about to claim their first piece. Milton Freewater drowsed in the unseasonable heat of late May 1957, a town of barely 3,000 souls pressed against the Oregon-Washington border. Main Street consisted of 2 blocks of sun-faded storefronts, a single traffic light that blinked yellow after 8 p.m., and Miller's Drug Store, where the locals gathered for coffee and gossip. The surrounding wheat fields stretched toward distant blue mountains like a golden ocean frozen in time. Thor parked their van outside the Wayside Motor Court, a collection of 8 whitewashed cabins arranged in a horseshoe around a gravel lot. The proprietor, a thick-waisted woman named Gladys Pepper, eyed them with the cautious curiosity small-town people reserve for strangers. "We're documenting rural America," Elowen explained, producing their forged credentials with a warm smile that transformed her severe features. "The unsung heroes of small communities, the people who built this country, but whose stories are disappearing." Gladys softened immediately, as people always did when told their town mattered. "Well, we've got plenty of history here. Founded in 1870s. Used to be two towns, Milton and Freewater, until they merged in 51. "Fascinating," Elowen murmured, taking notes in her leather journal. "Are there any particularly interesting long-time residents? People who remember the old days? Preferably someone living alone who might have time for an extended interview?" Gladys thought for a moment, her face brightening. "Oh, you should talk to Oswald Grunberg. He's been here since '38, came over from Germany before the war. Runs, well, used to run, the watch repair shop on 2nd Street. Lives alone in that house behind the shop. Wife died of pneumonia in '49. Never had children. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's sharp as a tack. Tells wonderful stories about the old country." Elowen and Thor exchanged the briefest of glances. Perfect. They found Oswald Grunberg's shop the next morning, a narrow building sandwiched between a closed hardware store and a barber shop. The window display showed a collection of pocket watches arranged on faded velvet, their faces frozen at various times like stopped moments of history. A small bell chimed as they entered. The interior smelled of machine oil and old wood. Hundreds of clocks lined the walls, most silent, a few ticking out of sync with each other. A discordant temporal symphony. Oswald emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was shorter than Thor by nearly a foot, with a horseshoe of white hair around a liver-spotted scalp and thick glasses that magnified watery brown eyes. His accent was still noticeably German, despite 2 decades in America. "Guten, good morning. How can I help you?" Elowen stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Grunberg, my name is Elowen Crawford, and this is my husband Thorvald. We're photographers working on a documentary project about immigrant contributions to American small towns. Mrs. Pepper at the Motor Court suggested you might have some fascinating stories to share." Oswald's weathered face creased with pleasure and surprise. "Me? I am just an old watchmaker. Nothing special." "That's exactly the kind of humility we're trying to combat," Thor said, his voice warm and earnest. He'd practiced this tone for months. "The backbone of America isn't famous people. It's skilled craftsmen like yourself who brought old-world expertise to build new communities. We'd love to photograph you in your workshop," Elowen added. "Document your craft, record your story. With your permission, of course. We're creating an archive for the Library of Congress." The lie came smoothly, seasoned with just enough detail to sound authentic. Oswald's resistance crumbled immediately. Like most lonely people, he was starved for attention, for validation that his life had meant something. "Well, if you think it would be interesting, yes, I would be honored." They arranged to return the following afternoon for the interview and photo session. As they left, Elowen added casually, "We typically conduct these sessions at the subject's home. It's more intimate, more authentic. Would that be acceptable?" Oswald nodded eagerly. "Of course. My house is just behind the shop. Very modest, but you are welcome." The next day arrived cloudless and hot. Elowen wore a professional dark skirt and white blouse, her hair perfectly pinned. Thor carried 2 camera cases and a leather satchel containing their recording equipment, and the thermos of poisoned coffee they'd prepared that morning. Oswald's house was indeed modest, a 2-room cottage with a sagging porch and yellowed lace curtains. Inside, every surface was crowded with partially disassembled timepieces, tools, and stacks of books in German. The air was close and smelled of tobacco and boiled cabbage. For 2 hours, they conducted a legitimate interview. Thor photographed Oswald at his workbench, hands manipulating tiny gears with surprising dexterity. Elowen recorded his story on their Webcore reel-to-reel tape recorder. His childhood in Hamburg, his apprenticeship, fleeing the rising Nazi regime, arriving at Ellis Island with $70 and a toolbox, eventually settling in this quiet corner of Oregon. After Greta died, Oswald said quietly, I had nothing but the work, no children to carry on the name. When I die, it will be as if I never existed. The Grunberg line ends with me. Elowen leaned forward, her pale green eyes luminous with false sympathy. That's exactly why this project is so important, Oswald. Your story deserves to be preserved. You matter. The old man's eyes glistened behind his thick lenses. Thank you. You are very kind. Thor glanced at Elowen. She nodded almost imperceptibly. This has been wonderful, Thor said, checking his watch. It's nearly 4 o'clock. Would you mind if we took a short break? Perhaps share some coffee? We brought a thermos. It's a small tradition of ours, to share a drink with our subjects, a toast to their legacy. Oh, that sounds lovely, Oswald said. I have some strudel a neighbor brought yesterday. We could— No need, Elowen interrupted smoothly. We've already taken so much of your time. Please sit, relax. Let us serve you for once. She poured the coffee into 3 cups she'd brought, though hers and Thor's contained only regular coffee from a separate thermos. Oswald's cup held 20 grains of secobarbital dissolved in strong coffee sweetened with brandy to mask the bitter taste. To Oswald Grunberg, Thor said, raising his cup, Master watchmaker, American immigrant, a life well lived. They clinked cups. Oswald drank deeply, smiling with genuine happiness. For the first time in years, someone had made him feel important, valued, remembered. 15 minutes later, his words began to slur. I feel strange, very tired suddenly. You've been working so hard, Elowen said soothingly. Why don't you lie down on the sofa? Just for a moment. Oswald didn't protest. Thor helped him to the worn davenport, and within 2 minutes, the old man was unconscious, breathing deeply and regularly. Elowen looked at Thor. Now. Thor removed a length of clothesline from his satchel. His hands were steady as he looped it around Oswald's throat. Elowen watched, her face serene, almost transcendent. This was their purpose. Their art? Thor pulled. Oswald never woke, never struggled. His breathing stopped after 90 seconds. The clocks ticked on, indifferent. They worked quickly and methodically, following their rehearsed plan. Thor brought the van to the back alley while Elowen wrapped Oswald's body in the tarp they'd hidden in their equipment case. They loaded him into the false bottom compartment, covered with camping gear and photographic equipment. Before leaving, Elowen selected her trophy, a gold pocket watch engraved with Oswald's initials and the date of his arrival in America, August 3, 1938. She also carefully packed the photographs Thor had taken and the reel of recorded interview. They locked Oswald's house, wiped their prints from surfaces they'd touched, and drove away at exactly 6:30 p.m. 2 neighbors saw their van leaving, but thought nothing of it. Just the nice photographers who'd been documenting Oswald's life. They drove northeast into the Umatilla National Forest, following logging roads Thor had scouted 2 days earlier. At a remote site 15 miles from any marked trail, they buried Oswald Grunberg 3 feet deep, marking the location on a hand-drawn map. As they shoveled the last of the earth over the grave, the sun set behind the blue mountains, painting the sky the color of arterial blood. Back in their motel room that night, Elowen mounted the photographs in their hidden shrine. She placed the pocket watch beside Oswald's portrait and wrote in her journal, Subject 1. Oswald Grunberg, age 54. Watchmaker. German immigrant. Died May 24, 1957. No surviving family. Now preserved, now remembered, now ours. Thor found her an hour later, standing before their collection, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, alarmed. She turned to him, her smile radiant. "Nothing's wrong. Everything's perfect. For the first time in my life, I feel truly alive. We gave him immortality, Thor. We saved him from oblivion." Thor embraced her, and they stood together in the dim motel room, two monsters wearing human skin, already planning their next acquisition. Oswald Grunberg wouldn't be reported missing for 11 days. By then, the Crawfords would be 200 miles away, hunting their next forgotten soul. The summer of 1958 found the Crawfords in Joseph, a mountain town of 900 souls cradled in the Wallowa Mountains of northeastern Oregon. The peaks towered above the valley like ancient sentinels, their snow-capped summits gleaming against impossible blue skies. Joseph had been named after Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, and a small population of Native Americans still lived on the edges of town, maintaining traditions that most white residents ignored or romanticized. Elowen had grown more confident in their hunting. The success with Oswald Grunberg had validated her philosophy, transformed her from theorist to practitioner. She'd gained weight, her cheeks now showing color, her movements more fluid and assured. Thor noticed she hummed while they drove, old hymns from a childhood she never discussed, rendered unsettling by context. They rented a cabin at the base of the mountains and spent a week integrating themselves into the community. Thor photographed the landscape for their cover, while Elowen volunteered at the local library, ingratiating herself with the librarian and carefully mining conversations for information about isolated residents. "There's an old Indian woman," the librarian, Mrs. Cordelia Finch, confided over tea. "Inata Silverstone. Must be nearly 70 now. Lives alone in a cabin up Sheep Creek. She weaves the most beautiful blankets using traditional methods, but she's quite reclusive. Her husband died in a logging accident back in '42, and her children all moved to Portland or Seattle. She comes to town maybe once a month for supplies." Elowen's pulse quickened. How tragic to be so alone. "Does anyone check on her?" "Oh, she's independent, proud, refuses charity or help. But you're right, it is lonely up there. Sometimes I worry about her, especially in winter." "Perhaps she'd appreciate someone documenting her craft," Elowen suggested carefully. "Traditional Native American weaving is exactly the kind of cultural heritage we're preserving. Do you think she'd speak with us?" Mrs. Finch looked doubtful. "Inata doesn't trust white people much." "Can't say I blame her, considering history, but you could try. She's usually home. The cabin's about 8 miles up the creek road. You can't miss it. Only structure up there." They found Inata Silverstone on a Wednesday morning in late July. Her cabin was a weathered structure of hand-hewn logs, chinked with moss and mud, surrounded by a split-rail fence. Chickens scratched in the yard. A massive loom stood on the covered porch, partially completed blankets stretched across its frame in geometric patterns of red, black, and white. Inata herself was smaller than Elowen expected, barely 5 feet tall, with steel-gray braids and a face mapped with deep wrinkles. She wore a simple cotton dress and moccasins, and her dark eyes held the wariness of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from strangers. "What do you want?" she asked in heavily accented English before they could introduce themselves. Thor raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Mrs. Silverstone, my name is Thorvald Crawford. This is my wife Elowen. We're documenting traditional crafts of the Pacific Northwest. Mrs. Finch at the library suggested you might be willing to share knowledge about your weaving." "Cordelia talks too much." But Inata's expression softened slightly. "You want to take pictures?" "With your permission, yes, and to record your story, how you learned the craft, what the patterns mean. We're creating an archive of American traditions that are disappearing." Inata studied them for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. You can come tomorrow. Morning light is best for photographs. But you bring tobacco. Li Wu, gift. That's the proper way. They returned the next morning with a pouch of Prince Albert tobacco and a loaf of bread from Joseph's bakery. Inata accepted both with a slight nod and led them onto the porch. For 3 hours, she demonstrated her craft while Thor photographed and Elowen recorded. Inata spoke about learning from her grandmother, about patterns that told stories of creation and migration, about natural dyes made from roots and berries. Her English improved as she grew comfortable, though she occasionally lapsed into Nez Perce when searching for words. This pattern, she said, pointing to interlocking triangles, shows the journey of the soul after death. My people believe we return to the earth, become part of the great cycle. Nothing is truly lost. That's beautiful, Elowen said, meaning it in her own twisted way. Do you have family who will carry on your knowledge? Inata's face darkened. My daughter married a white man, moved to Seattle. She's ashamed of the old ways. My son, her voice caught. He died in Korea, 1951. So no, when I die, this knowledge dies with me. That seems terribly unfair, Thor said quietly. You've preserved something precious. You deserve to be remembered. Inata looked at him with something approaching gratitude. You understand. Most whites don't care about Indian ways. We care, Elowen said. Very much. They worked through the afternoon. As the light began to fail, Elowen produced their thermos. We've been so rude, letting you work without offering refreshment. Please, we have coffee. It's a small tradition of ours to share a drink with the people we photograph. Inata hesitated, then accepted the cup Elowen poured. The secco barbital was there, dissolved in strong coffee sweetened with honey. She drank slowly, savoring it. Good coffee, she said, then her eyes widened slightly. I feel strange. You've been working so hard, Thor said gently. Why don't you rest inside? Just for a moment. They helped her into the cabin's single room. She collapsed onto her bed, unconscious within minutes. Thor waited exactly 5 minutes. They'd learned from experience that this was optimal, before removing the rope. This time felt different to Elowen. As Thor worked, she studied Inata's face. The deep lines carved by 70 years of joy and suffering, the calluses on her hands from decades of weaving. This woman had created beauty, had fought to preserve her culture against overwhelming erasure. We're saving her, Elowen whispered, not sure if she was trying to convince Thor or herself. Making sure she's not forgotten. Thor nodded, finishing his grim task. Inata Silverstone died without pain, without knowledge, simply ceasing to exist as quietly as a candle guttering out. They buried her in a grove of aspens 5 miles from her cabin, deeper than Oswald. 4 feet this time, with quicklime to accelerate decomposition. They took 3 of her woven pieces, a silver bracelet engraved with traditional symbols, and all the photographs. Before leaving, Thor burned the cabin. It would look like an accident. An overturned lantern, perhaps. The fire would explain Inata's disappearance, make it seem like she'd fled or died in the blaze, her body consumed. The authorities might search, but they'd find nothing definitive. As flames consumed the structure, Elowen felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify. Not regret, not guilt, perhaps recognition that they were erasing not just a person, but a world. She was the last one who knew those patterns, Elowen said, watching the loom collapse in flames. Now only we remember. We're the keepers of memory now, Thor agreed, taking her hand. They drove away as volunteer firefighters raced up the mountain road. By morning, they'd be in Prairie City, already hunting their next subject. Prairie City in October 1959 was a town of gold rush ghosts and dying dreams. Once a booming mining center, it had dwindled to fewer than 1,000 residents who remained out of stubbornness or lack of alternatives. The mountains loomed close, already dusted with early snow. Their third victim found them, rather than the reverse. Delmar Hatch was 41 but looked 60, weathered by decades of outdoor labor. He drifted between logging camps and construction sites, sleeping in cheap motels or his battered pickup truck. He had no permanent address, no family, no friends, only a reputation as a skilled carpenter, willing to work for cash and ask no questions. They met him in the Prairie Schooner Cafe, where he sat alone at the counter, nursing black coffee and a plate of eggs. Thor struck up a conversation about the quality of local woodwork, and Delmar responded with the desperate friendliness of the chronically lonely. "I can build anything," he said, his voice rough from cigarettes and whiskey. "Learned from my daddy before he drank himself to death. Been all over Oregon, Washington, Idaho. Go where the work is." "A craftsman," Elowen said warmly. "That's exactly what we're documenting. Skilled workers whose artistry often goes unrecognized." Delmar's eyes lit up. Nobody had ever called him an artist before. They photographed him in an abandoned barn outside town, his hands working a plane across a piece of pine, creating perfect curls of wood shavings. He spoke about joinery techniques, about reading grain patterns, about the satisfaction of creating something that would outlast him. "Don't got much to show for my life," he admitted. "No wife, no kids. Just moved around too much, I guess. Sometimes I wonder if anyone would notice if I just disappeared one day." "We'd notice," Elowen said softly. "We're noticing right now. You matter, Delmar." His eyes filled with tears. This simple validation, this acknowledgement of his existence, undid him completely. When they offered him the poisoned coffee, he accepted gratefully, touched that these educated people would share a drink with someone like him. He died in that barn, surrounded by sawdust and the smell of pine. They buried him in the Malheur National Forest, deeper still, 5 feet this time. They took his best wood plane, engraved with his father's initials, and a black and white photograph of a young woman Delmar had carried in his wallet for 20 years. "The one that got away," he'd called her. By late 1959, the Crawfords had perfected their system. They'd learned to vary their timing, to never stay in one region too long, to choose victims whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation. They'd refined their burial techniques, their site selection, their entire methodology. Their collection grew. In the hidden shrine in their van, 6 photographs now hung in neat rows: Oswald with his watches, Inata at her loom, Delmar holding his plane, each accompanied by their trophies, their proof of existence. Elowen had filled 30 pages of her journal with meticulous details: physical descriptions, life histories, final words, burial coordinates. She reviewed these entries nightly, like a priest studying sacred texts. "We're doing important work," she told Thor one evening as they drove through the darkness between towns. "We're the only thing standing between these people and absolute oblivion. Without us, they'd simply cease to exist, forgotten by everyone. But we remember. We preserve them." Thor nodded, though sometimes in quiet moments he wondered if she actually believed this, or if it was a necessary fiction they'd constructed to justify the unjustifiable. Not that it mattered. He'd crossed too many lines to turn back now. They both had. What neither of them knew was that patterns were emerging. Disappearances in small Oregon towns, always isolated individuals, always following visits from a photographer couple. The pattern was faint, barely visible, but it was there, waiting for someone smart enough and patient enough to see it. That someone was already forming theories in a small sheriff's office 3 counties away. The net was beginning to close, though it would be months before the Crawfords felt its first threads tightening around them. Fossil, Oregon, existed as little more than a stubborn memory in the high desert country of Wheeler County. Population: 473 souls, most of them ranchers or employees of the single lumber mill. The town had been named for the prehistoric remains found in the surrounding shale formations, ancient fish and plants pressed into stone, proof that life had once flourished where now only sagebrush and juniper survived. It was April 1960 when the Crawfords arrived, and the spring winds carried grit that found its way into everything: clothes, food, teeth. They rented a room at Ma Henderson's boarding house, a sagging Victorian that creaked in the wind like a ship at sea. "Looking for interesting subjects," Elowen told Ma Henderson, a formidable woman of 60 with arms like fence posts. "Long-time residents with stories to tell." Ma thought for a moment, her weathered face skeptical. These photographer types came through occasionally, took their pictures, then disappeared back to wherever they came from, never sharing the results. But money was money. "There's Vivian McQuaid," Ma said finally. "Runs, well, ran the town library. Husband died in a ranch accident 7 years back. No children. Lives alone in that blue house on Sycamore Street. She's only 38, but seems older, if you know what I mean. Grief does that." Elowen felt the familiar anticipatory thrill. "She sounds perfect for our project. Do you think she'd be receptive?" "Vivian's lonely," Ma said bluntly. "Lost in books and memories. She'd probably appreciate the company." Vivian McQuaid answered her door on the third knock, a slender woman with prematurely graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a cardigan despite the relative warmth, and her hazel eyes held the distant look of someone who lived more in her head than in the present. "Mrs. McQuaid," Elowen began with her practiced warmth, "my name is Elowen Crawford. This is my husband Thor. We're documenting the lives of remarkable women in rural Oregon. Librarians, teachers, nurses, the intellectual backbone of small communities. Ma Henderson suggested you might be willing to speak with us." Vivian's hand fluttered to her throat. "Me? I'm not remarkable. I just catalog books and help people find information." "That's exactly the kind of humility that makes your work so valuable," Thor said earnestly. "You're preserving knowledge, connecting your community to the wider world. That's profound." Despite her reservations, Vivian invited them inside. Her house was immaculate but lifeless, furniture arranged precisely, surfaces dust-free, but no personal touches beyond photographs of a dark-haired man Elowen assumed was the deceased husband. The rooms smelled of lemon polish and loneliness. Over the next 2 days, they conducted their interview. Vivian spoke about growing up in Portland, meeting Robert McQuaid at a county fair, moving to Fossil full of optimism, then watching that optimism drain away as her husband worked himself to death, trying to make a failing ranch profitable. After his death, she'd taken the librarian position to survive. "I thought I'd leave after Robert died," she said quietly, serving them tea in her spotless kitchen. "Go back to Portland, start over. But 7 years passed, and here I am. I think I was waiting for something, though I don't know what." "Purpose," Elowen said softly. "Meaning, the sense that your life matters." "Yes," Vivian whispered. "Exactly that." Thor photographed her among her books, in the library's reading room, at her kitchen table with Robert's photograph. She opened up more each day, sharing details about her marriage, her loneliness, her secret fear that she'd die and nobody would notice for weeks. "Sometimes I think about just disappearing," she admitted during their third session, "walking into the desert and never coming back. Becoming one of those fossils the town is named for. Something that existed once, but doesn't matter anymore." "You matter to us," Elowen said, reaching across to squeeze Vivian's hand. "We're making sure you're remembered. Your story will be preserved." On the fourth day, they prepared to complete their work. But something felt different this time. Vivian had grown attached to them, viewing them almost as friends rather than professional documentarians. She'd invited them to dinner at her home, a rare gesture from someone so isolated. "I've made pot roast," she said, her eyes bright with an emotion the Crawfords found unsettling. Hope. It was Robert's favorite. "I haven't cooked it since he died, but having you here feels special. Like life is starting again." Thor and Elowen exchanged glances. This complication was unexpected. They'd planned to use the poisoned coffee that afternoon, but Vivian's invitation disrupted their timeline. Refusing would seem suspicious, but attending meant extending their stay, increasing their exposure. "We'd be honored," Elowen said finally, though unease twisted in her stomach. That evening, as they ate Vivian's carefully prepared meal, something shifted in the dynamic. Vivian had dressed nicely, styled her hair, applied subtle makeup. She laughed at Thor's jokes, engaged enthusiastically with Elowen's observations about small-town life. She was performing normalcy, performing happiness, trying desperately to convince them, and herself, that she was worth knowing. "You're the first real friends I've had since Robert died," she said over dessert, her eyes glistening. "Most people in Fossil see me as poor Vivian, the tragic widow. But you see me as a person. That means everything." Elowen felt something unfamiliar. Discomfort. Not guilt. Never guilt. But recognition that they'd miscalculated. Vivian wasn't just lonely. She was drowning in isolation and had mistaken their professional interest for genuine connection. "We're so glad we met you," Elowen said, and part of her meant it. Vivian was intelligent, articulate, deserving of a better life than this slow death in a dying town. But that didn't change what had to happen. After dinner, as Elowen prepared to offer the poisoned coffee, someone knocked on Vivian's door. "Oh!" Vivian looked flustered. "I'm not expecting anyone." She opened the door to reveal a woman in her 50s, stocky and sun-weathered, carrying a covered dish. "Vivian, I made extra cobbler and thought you might—" The woman stopped, seeing Thor and Elowen. "Oh, you have company. I'm sorry to interrupt." "No, no, come in, Martha," Vivian said, her voice taking on a forced brightness. "These are the photographers I mentioned, Elowen and Thor Crawford. This is Martha Yates. She runs the general store." Martha's sharp eyes assessed them thoroughly. "The photographers?" "Yes, Vivian mentioned you. Staying at Ma's place, right?" "That's correct," Thor said smoothly. "We've been documenting Mrs. McQuaid's important work at the library." Martha set down her cobbler, but her expression remained skeptical. "Funny thing, we don't get many professional photographers out here. And I notice your van has California plates, but you said you were working for an Oregon Historical Society." Elowen's smile never wavered, though her heart rate spiked. "We relocated recently. Haven't updated the registration yet. You know how bureaucracy is." Martha said again, non-committal. She stayed for exactly 15 minutes, making small talk, but watching the Crawfords with undisguised suspicion. When she finally left, she hugged Vivian and said, loud enough for Thor and Elowen to hear, "You call me if you need anything. Anything at all." After Martha departed, the evening's warmth had evaporated. Vivian seemed embarrassed by her friend's protectiveness. "I'm sorry about Martha. She's been watching over me since Robert died. Sometimes too much." "She cares about you," Elowen said. "That's good." But internally, alarm bells were ringing. They'd been seen, assessed, and doubted by someone who would remember them. Someone who would ask questions if Vivian disappeared. They made their excuses shortly after, claiming early appointments the next day. Back at Ma Henderson's, they sat in their room in tense silence. "We need to abort," Thor said finally. "That woman saw us, and she's suspicious. If Vivian vanishes now, we'll be the first people they look for. But we've invested so much time, Elowen protested. We have the photographs, the recordings. She fits our collection perfectly. She's also connected. Martha visits. Other people know about us now. It's too risky. Elowen paced the small room, her face flushed with frustration. This was the first time they'd had to abandon a subject, and it felt like failure. But Thor was right. They'd made mistakes, stayed too long, become too visible, let their subject form attachments. We leave tomorrow, Thor decided. First light, we'll finish the documentation remotely and move on. Fine, Elowen said, but her jaw was tight with displeasure. They departed Fossil at dawn, telling Ma Henderson they'd been called away for a family emergency. As they drove east toward the town of Antelope, neither of them noticed the curtain moving in Martha Yates's upstairs window, or the way she wrote down their license plate number in a small notepad. 2 days later, Vivian McQuaid failed to open the library at its usual time. Martha, already concerned about the photographer's abrupt departure, went to check on her friend. She found Vivian in bed, alive but barely conscious, an empty bottle of sleeping pills on her nightstand. Martha called Dr. Westerly, who pumped Vivian's stomach and saved her life. When Vivian woke in the hospital, she was confused and grief-stricken. She claimed she'd taken the pills accidentally, mixing up her dosage, but Martha didn't believe it. She thought about those photographers, about how happy Vivian had seemed when they were there, and how devastated she'd been when they left. Martha went to the sheriff's office and filed a report, not about a crime exactly, but about suspicious visitors who'd upset her friend. The deputy took notes, but didn't seem particularly interested. Just some photographers who'd left town. Nothing unusual. But Martha kept the license plate number. And she kept watching. Because something about those people had struck her as deeply, fundamentally wrong. Far to the east, in Antelope, the Crawfords were already hunting again, trying to erase the bitter taste of their first failure. They didn't know that, for the first time, someone was paying attention to their pattern. They didn't know that their perfect system had developed its first crack. And they didn't know that this crack would eventually split wide enough to swallow them whole. Antelope, Oregon, was barely a town, more a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against the high desert wind. Population, 47. 1 gas station, 1 combination, store and post office, a scattering of ranches spread across thousands of acres of scrubland. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noted with the wariness reserved for coyotes near the chicken coop. It was May 1961, and the Crawfords were angry. The failure with Vivian McQuaid had festered between them for months, an infected wound they couldn't stop picking at. They'd argued about whose fault it was. Thor blamed Elowen's desire to prolong the contact. Elowen blamed Thor's paranoia. But ultimately, they agreed on one thing. They needed to prove they could still execute perfectly. Antelope would be their redemption. Corbett Rush lived 8 miles outside town, in a cabin he'd built himself after retiring from the Park Service in 1958. At 59, he was lean and hard as jerky, his face carved by decades of sun and wind. He'd never married, had no family anyone knew of, and seemed content with his dogs, his books, and the vast silence of the desert. They found him at the general store, buying supplies, flour, coffee, ammunition for his rifle. Thor struck up a conversation about the local wildlife, and Corbett responded with the cautious friendliness of someone who'd spent years dealing with tourists. "Photographer, huh?" Corbett said when Thor explained their cover. "Don't get many of those out here. Nothing much to photograph but rocks and sagebrush." "That's exactly what we're interested in," Elowen interjected smoothly. "The people who choose to live in these harsh environments. What draws someone to seek solitude in the high desert? What wisdom do they gain from it?" Corbett's weathered face creased in what might have been amusement. "Wisdom? I just like the quiet. Too many years of tourists asking stupid questions in the parks. Out here, nobody bothers me. Would you consider being bothered one last time? Thor asked. For posterity. Your experience as a ranger, your knowledge of the land, that's valuable cultural information. Corbett studied them for a long moment. Finally, he shrugged. Sure, why not? Come by tomorrow afternoon. But I'm not putting on any show. You photograph what you see, nothing staged. Corbett's cabin was solid, built with a craftsman's care from salvaged lumber and native stone. Inside, it was surprisingly well appointed. Shelves of books on natural history and philosophy, maps marking his years of service in Yellowstone and Crater Lake, photographs of landscapes so beautiful they seemed unreal. My wife died in childbirth, Corbett said abruptly during their interview, answering a question they hadn't asked. 1932. Baby died too. Never saw much point in trying again. Figured I'd just do my work and try not to think about it too much. Thor photographed him outside with his dogs, two aging border collies named Lewis and Clark. Elowen recorded his stories about grisly encounters, forest fires, tourists who'd gotten themselves into fatal trouble through sheer stupidity. People don't respect nature, Corbett said. They think it's like a zoo, everything's safe and controlled. But the wilderness doesn't care about you. It'll kill you without malice, without even noticing. That's the truth most people can't accept. But you accept it, Elowen said. I respect it. There's a difference. I know my place in the order of things. I'm just another animal out here, trying to survive until I don't. As the afternoon wore into evening, Thor prepared to offer the poisoned coffee. But Corbett pulled out his own thermos. Brought my own, he said. No offense, but I learned in the Rangers never to accept food or drink from strangers. Too many stories of people drugging and robbing folks out in the backcountry. Thor and Elowen froze. Their entire method depended on this moment. Without the drugged coffee, they had no safe way to subdue him. Corbett was lean but strong, and he had a rifle leaning against the doorframe. Any physical confrontation would be dangerous and messy. None taken, Thor said smoothly, though his mind raced. Good policy. They finished the interview without incident, packed their equipment, and left. Corbett waved from his porch, the dogs at his feet, as they drove away down the rutted dirt road. A mile from the cabin, Thor pulled over. What now? Elowen demanded. We can't just leave. Not after Vivian. We need this. We go back tonight, Thor said quietly. After he's asleep. We break in. That's too risky. What if he wakes up? What if he has a gun by his bed? Then we handle it. Thor's voice was cold, determined. We didn't come this far to fail again. They returned at 2 a.m., parking the van a half-mile away and approaching on foot. The desert night was surprisingly cold, the stars so bright they cast faint shadows. Corbett's cabin showed no lights, but the dogs would be a problem. Thor had prepared for this. He'd brought hamburger meat laced with enough secobarbital to knock out both dogs. They scattered it near the porch, then waited in the darkness. Lewis found it first, then Clark. Within 15 minutes, both dogs were unconscious. Thor tested the cabin door. Unlocked. Of course. Who locked their doors out here? Inside, they waited for their eyes to adjust. Corbett's breathing was audible from the single bedroom. Thor moved silently across the wooden floor, Elowen behind him, rope ready in his hands. They reached the bedroom doorway. Corbett lay on his back, one arm flung over his head, deeply asleep. Thor took a step forward. The floorboard creaked. Corbett's eyes snapped open. His hand moved with trained speed toward the nightstand. Thor lunged, tackling him before he could reach whatever was in the drawer. They crashed to the floor, Corbett fighting with desperate strength, making terrible choking sounds as he tried to scream. Elowen stood frozen, watching the struggle. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. This was chaos, violence, Real. Thor got the rope around Corbett's throat, pulling tight. The old ranger thrashed, his hands clawing at the rope, at Thor's face, drawing blood. It took 3 minutes for Corbett to stop moving. 3 eternal minutes of struggling and gasping, and the awful sounds of a man fighting for his life. When it was finally over, Thor sat back, breathing hard, his face scratched and bleeding. "We need to leave," Elowen whispered. "Right now. This is wrong. This is all wrong." Thor stood, wiping blood from his cheek. "Get the tarp from the van. We finish this." They wrapped Corbett's body and carried it outside. The dogs were still unconscious. They loaded the corpse into the van. Then Thor went back inside and staged a burglary. Drawers pulled open, items scattered, the cabin ransacked. It wouldn't fool a thorough investigation, but it might buy them time. They buried Corbett in the Ochoko National Forest, their deepest grave yet, 6 feet down, with quicklime. They took his ranger badge and a compass, engraved with his initials, but Elowen didn't photograph him for their collection. Somehow, this one felt different. Tainted. 2 days later, a rancher checking on Corbett found the ransacked cabin and the dead dogs. The sheriff's department from Fossil, which covered this part of Wheeler County, responded. Sheriff Mervyn Dowsett, a methodical man of 45 with 20 years of law enforcement experience, walked through the scene with growing unease. Dogs were poisoned, the vet confirmed. Secobarbital, mixed with meat. "So someone planned this," Dowsett said. "Came prepared to handle the dogs. That's premeditated." He examined the staged burglary with a skeptical eye. Nothing of significant value had been taken. The rifle was still there, a cigar box of cash untouched. But personal items were missing. Photographs, papers, Corbett's ranger badge. "This doesn't look like robbery," Deputy Thatcher said. "Looks like someone wanted it to look like robbery." Dowsett nodded slowly. Then he remembered something. He went to his office and pulled out a thin file. Reports from the past 4 years. Oswald Grunberg in Milton Freewater, 1957. Inata Silverstone in Joseph, 1958. Presumed dead in a cabin fire, body never recovered. Delmar Hatch in Prairie City, 1959. Reported missing, never found. Vivian McQuaid in Fossil, 1960. Suicide attempt, recovered, but mentioned photographers who'd visited her. And now, Corbett Rush in Antelope, 1961. Missing, presumed murdered. Dowsett spread the reports across his desk. Different towns, different circumstances. But a pattern emerged if you looked carefully enough. All victims were isolated, alone, no close family, all in small eastern Oregon communities. And in at least 2 cases, Vivian and Corbett, photographers had been involved shortly before the incident. He pulled out the note Martha Yates had given him months ago. California license plate number. Description of a couple. Blonde man, tall, auburn-haired woman, pale green eyes. "Thatcher," Dowsett called, "get me every missing persons report in eastern Oregon for the past 5 years, and start calling around to sheriffs in neighboring counties. I want to know about any unusual disappearances, especially involving single people with no family." "You think we've got a serial case?" Thatcher asked, his young face showing alarm. "I think we might have something worse than that," Dowsett said quietly. "I think we've got smart killers who've been operating under our noses for years." Far to the south, near Mitchell, the Crawfords had no idea that the net was finally closing. They'd added Corbett to their collection, though the memory of his violent death disturbed even Elowen's carefully constructed philosophy. "We need to be more careful," she said one night, reviewing their maps and planning their next move. "We need to stop," Thor said quietly. Elowen looked at him in shock. "What?" "Just for a while. Let things cool down. That wasn't clean. Someone might have seen us leaving Antelope. We're taking too many risks." "We can't stop," Elowen insisted. "The collection isn't complete. We have work to do." But for the first time since they'd started, Thor wondered if his wife had crossed a line he hadn't. If she'd become so consumed by their twisted purpose that she'd lost sight of survival. And in Fossil, Sheriff Dowsett was making phone calls, connecting dots, building a case file on two killers who didn't yet know they were being hunted. The game was changing. The hunters were about to become the hunted. Sheriff Mervyn Dowsett's office in Fossil had become a command center by late autumn of 1961. Maps of eastern Oregon covered one wall, red pins marking locations: Milton Freewater, Joseph, Prairie City, Fossil, Antelope. 5 incidents spanning 4 years, 5 lives disrupted or ended. And somewhere in that pattern, Dowsett was certain, were the Crawfords. He'd spent 3 months making calls, visiting neighboring jurisdictions, pulling records. The Oregon State Police had initially dismissed his theory. Serial killers were rare, and the evidence was circumstantial at best. But Dowsett was persistent, and gradually other sheriffs began sharing information. "Got something from Wasco County," Deputy Thatcher said, entering with a folder. "Woman named Gladys Pepper in Milton Freewater. Remembers a photographer couple renting from her motor court in May 1957, right around when Oswald Grunberg disappeared." Dowsett opened the folder. Gladys had provided descriptions. Man in his early 30s, very blonde, spoke with slight accent, possibly Scandinavian. Woman late 20s, auburn hair with gray streaks, pale green eyes, intense manner. They'd claimed to be working on a documentary about rural America. "That matches Martha Yates's description from Fossil," Dowsett said, "and the timing fits." "There's more," Thatcher continued, "called National Geographic, like you suggested. They have no record of any photographers named Crawford working for them, officially or freelance. The whole cover story is fabricated." Dowsett felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came with breaking a case. "So we've got a couple using false credentials, appearing in multiple towns where people subsequently died or disappeared. We need to find them before they kill again." "If they haven't already," Thatcher said grimly. Dowsett organized a multi-county task force. Himself, Thatcher, Sheriff Clayton Webb from Grant County, and Detective Roy Kimball from the Oregon State Police. They met in Dowsett's office on a cold November afternoon, coffee steaming in chipped mugs as they reviewed the evidence. "The pattern is clear," Kimball said, a lean man with hard eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. "They target isolated individuals with no close family ties, use the photographer cover to gain trust. Then the victim disappears or dies under suspicious circumstances." "But we only have one body," Webb pointed out. "Corbett Roosh. The others are just missing persons. Grunberg, Hatch. Silverstone's case is complicated by the fire. And McQuaid survived." "The fire wasn't accidental," Dowsett insisted. "The state fire marshal found accelerant traces. Someone burned that cabin deliberately. And Vivian McQuaid tried to kill herself after the Crawfords left town. That's not coincidence." "Still mostly circumstantial," Kimball said. "We need more. Physical evidence. Witnesses who can positively identify them. Ideally, we need to catch them in the act. Or we need to find the bodies," Webb said quietly. They stared at the map, at the vast stretches of national forest and high desert between the red pins. Hundreds of thousands of acres where bodies could be hidden and never found. "They're mobile," Dowsett said, "living out of a vehicle probably. The California plates Martha Yates recorded. I ran them. Registered to a Ford panel van purchased in Eugene in 1957 under the name Thorvald Crawford. Address listed is an apartment building. Landlord says they moved out that same year. No forwarding address." "So they've been nomadic since '57, Kimball said. "Living in the van, moving from town to town. Smart, harder to track." We need to get their information out to every sheriff's office, police department, and ranger station in Oregon, Dowsett said. Descriptions, vehicle information, their method. Someone will spot them eventually. If they're still in Oregon, Webb cautioned. They could have moved to Washington, Idaho, California. No, Dowsett said with certainty. They'll stay in Oregon, Eastern Oregon specifically. This is their hunting ground. They've perfected their system here. They won't abandon it unless we force them to. The bulletin went out on November 29, 1961. Persons of interest in multiple suspicious deaths/disappearances. Thorvald, Thor. Crawford, male, early to mid-30s, 6 feet 2 inches, blonde hair, blue eyes, slight Scandinavian accent. Elowen Crawford, female, late 20s, early 30s, 5 feet 6 inches, auburn hair with gray streaks, pale green eyes. May be traveling in 1954 Ford panel van, beige, California plates. Claim to be photographers working on documentary project. Approach with caution. Contact Sheriff Dowsett, Wheeler County, with any information. The bulletin included sketches based on witness descriptions, rough but recognizable. Copies were distributed to every law enforcement office in the Pacific Northwest. In small-town post offices, general stores, and gas stations, the flyers went up alongside wanted posters for check forgers and cattle thieves. Most people glanced at them and forgot. But some paid attention. The Crawfords, meanwhile, had relocated to Mitchell, another tiny Wheeler County town, population 93. They'd been lying low since Corbett Rush, living quietly in their van in various campgrounds, doing legitimate photography work to maintain their cover and income. Elowen had grown gaunt again, her face angular and shadowed. The violence of Corbett's death had shaken something loose in her carefully constructed philosophy. She spent hours staring at their collection, the photographs and trophies that were supposed to provide meaning, but now seemed like evidence of something she couldn't quite name. "We should move on," Thor said one evening. They were camped in a grove of juniper trees outside Mitchell, the November cold seeping through the van's thin walls. "Head to California. Start fresh somewhere else." "No," Elowen said sharply. "We have work here. The collection isn't complete." "Ellie, listen to yourself. You're obsessed. This isn't about preservation anymore, if it ever was. We're killers. That's all we are." She turned on him, her pale eyes blazing. "Don't you dare. Don't you dare reduce what we do to simple murder. We're saving these people from oblivion. We're the only ones who remember them, who care that they existed. We're the ones who killed them." Thor's voice rose. "We're not saviors. We're not artists. We're just two damaged people who found a way to justify the unjustifiable." Elowen slapped him, the crack sharp in the confined space. They stared at each other, breathing hard, the truth hanging between them like smoke. "One more," Elowen said finally. "Just one more. Then we'll stop. We'll have 6, a complete collection. That's symmetrical. Perfect. Then we can retire." Thor touched his stinging cheek, seeing his wife clearly for perhaps the first time in years. She was broken, had maybe always been broken, and he'd enabled her madness because it had given his own emptiness purpose. "One more," he agreed quietly. "Then we stop." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Neither of them could stop. The collection had become their entire identity, the only thing that made them feel real. Without it, they'd be as empty and forgotten as their victims. They chose their target carefully. Evander Talius, 44 years old, a Korean War veteran living alone in a trailer on the outskirts of Mitchell. He worked odd jobs, drank too much, and spoke to almost no one. The local VA office had tried to get him into treatment for what they called combat fatigue, but Evander refused all help. Perfect, Elowen thought. Another forgotten soul. They approached him at the Mitchell General Store in early December. Thor struck up a conversation about military service. He claimed his father had served in World War I. Evander responded warily, but eventually warmed up. "You a photographer?" Evander asked, noticing Thor's camera bag. "Documenting veterans," Thor said. "The men who served but came home to nothing. Your stories matter." Evander's laugh was bitter. "Nobody cares about Korea. Not like the big war. We're just the forgotten conflict. The forgotten men." "That's exactly why we're doing this project," Elowen said gently. "To make sure you're not forgotten." Evander studied them both with eyes that had seen too much. "You two are lying." The Crawfords froze. "I don't know what you're really after," Evander continued, "but it ain't no photography project. I've met enough liars in my life to spot them. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying." He turned and walked out of the store, leaving Thor and Elowen standing there, their cover blown for the first time. "He knows," Elowen whispered. "We have to silence him. Tonight." "Ellie? No. This is too dangerous. He's suspicious. We need to leave." "We can't leave loose ends." Her voice rose, drawing looks from other customers. She forced herself to calm down. "Tonight. We have no choice." Thor knew she was right, in a terrible way. If Evander talked to the local sheriff, described them, someone might connect them to the bulletin that was already circulating. They'd become too visible, too careless. They were trapped by their own patterns, forced to keep killing to cover their tracks. The net was tightening, but they couldn't see it yet. They only felt its pressure, driving them toward increasingly desperate measures. And in Fossil, Sheriff Dowsett's phone rang with the first sighting. A store clerk in Mitchell reporting a couple matching the description, talking to a local veteran named Evander Tullius. "How long ago?" Dowsett asked. "Today? Few hours ago. Should I?" "Don't approach them," Dowsett said. "Get me the vet's address. We're coming now." He grabbed Thatcher and his service revolver. Mitchell was only 18 miles away. If they drove fast, they might arrive before the Crawfords did whatever they were planning. For the first time in 4 years, the killers and the law were converging on the same point, racing toward a confrontation neither side was fully prepared for. Evander Tullius sat in his trailer as darkness fell over Mitchell, cleaning his service pistol. A Colt M1911 he'd carried through 2 years of Korean hell and brought home against regulations. The weight of it in his hands was comforting, familiar. He'd known combat, known the smell of death, known what human beings were capable of when stripped of civilization's veneer. And he'd recognized that same capacity in the photographer couple. Something in the woman's eyes, that pale green intensity that looked through you rather than at you. Something in the man's studied casualness that didn't quite ring true. Evander had learned in Korea to trust his instincts about danger, and every instinct screamed that these people were predators. He'd come home to check his trailer's locks and load his pistol. If they came, and he suspected they would, he'd be ready. At 9 p.m., he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. No headlights, someone trying to approach quietly. Evander moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. The beige panel van, barely visible in the moonlight. 2 figures emerging, moving with practiced stealth toward his trailer. The blond man carried something, a crowbar maybe, or a pipe. The woman held what looked like a length of rope. Evander's combat training kicked in. He couldn't let them reach the door. He'd be trapped inside. Better to take the initiative, control the engagement. He grabbed his pistol, chambered around, and threw open the trailer door. "That's far enough," he shouted, leveling the weapon at Thor's center mass. "Drop whatever you're carrying and get on the ground. Now!" Thor froze, the tire iron falling from his hands. Elowen stood paralyzed, the rope dangling from her grip. They'd expected a drunk, broken veteran, easy prey. Instead, they faced a trained soldier with a loaded weapon and the will to use it. "You're making a mistake," Thor said, raising his hands slowly. "We just wanted to talk." "Bullshit," Evander cut him off. "I know what you are. I've seen killers before. You've got that same emptiness. Now get on the ground before I put you there." For a moment, the standoff held. Then Elowen moved, darting toward the van with startling speed. Evander's instinct was to track her with his weapon, which gave Thor a split-second opening. Thor lunged. Evander fired, the shot echoing across the empty desert night. The bullet caught Thor in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell hard, blood spreading across his jacket. Elowen screamed, a sound of pure animal rage. She'd reached the van and now emerged with something in her hands. Another gun, Evander realized. Where the hell had they gotten a gun? He dove behind his pickup truck as Elowen fired wildly, 3 shots that went high and wide. She was panicking, not aiming, but she was between him and his trailer, and Thor was crawling toward the van, leaving a blood trail. Evander made a decision. He couldn't fight them both in the dark, didn't know if they had more weapons. He needed help. He sprinted for the tree line behind his trailer, expecting bullets to follow. None came. Behind him, he heard Elowen helping Thor into the van, her voice high and frantic. The engine roared to life, headlights suddenly blazing. Evander ran, crashing through sagebrush and juniper, heading for the nearest neighbor half a mile away. Behind him, the van's engine faded into the distance, heading east toward the national forest. Sheriff Dowsett and Deputy Thatcher arrived at Evander's trailer 15 minutes later, service revolvers drawn. They found blood on the gravel, a dropped tire iron and rope, 3 spent shell casings, and Evander's service pistol lying where he dropped it in his flight. "Thatcher, call for backup and an ambulance," Dowsett ordered. "Then start searching for—" "Sheriff!" A shout from the darkness. Evander emerged from the tree line, breathing hard. "They're gone. Headed east. The man's shot. I hit him in the shoulder." Dowsett holstered his weapon. "Mr. Tullius, you're okay?" "I'm fine. But those people, the photographers, they tried to kill me. Had a tire iron, rope. Would have done it too if I hadn't been ready." "We know," Dowsett said grimly. "We've been tracking them for months. We need you to tell us everything." While Thatcher radioed for roadblocks and additional units, Evander recounted the confrontation. His description matched the bulletin perfectly. Thor Crawford, Elowen Crawford, the beige Ford van. "They're wounded now," Dowsett said. "The man anyway. That changes things. They can't go to a hospital without questions. They'll need to hide, treat the wound themselves, and they know we're onto them." "They'll run," Thatcher predicted. "No," Dowsett said slowly, thinking it through. "They'll go to ground somewhere they know. Somewhere they've been before, maybe. Somewhere they feel safe." He turned to his deputy. "Get me every campground, every motel, every possible hideout in Wheeler and Grant counties. Focus on national forest land. They've been burying their victims in remote areas. They know the territory. That's thousands of square miles of forest, Sheriff. Then we'd better start searching." The Crawfords' van bounced along a logging road deep in the Ochoco National Forest, Thor groaning with each jolt. Blood soaked through the makeshift bandage Elowen had tied around his shoulder. The bullet had gone through, which was good. No surgery needed, but he'd lost significant blood, and the wound needed proper cleaning. "We need to stop," Thor gasped. "I can't—" "Not yet. Not until we're far enough away." Elowen's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel, her face rigid with fear and fury. Everything was falling apart. Their perfect system, their careful planning, destroyed by one suspicious veteran. She finally stopped in a clearing they'd used before, during the Corbett Roosh disposal. No one had found them here then. It would be safe now. She helped Thor into the back of the van, where their collection stared down at them from the hidden shrine. 6 faces, 6 forgotten souls, 6 murders. Using supplies from their medical kit, Elowen cleaned Thor's wound with alcohol, drawing sharp gasps of pain. The entry and exit wounds were clean, but infection was a serious risk. "We need antibiotics," Thor said through gritted teeth. "Need a doctor." "We can't risk it. I'll get sulfa drugs from a pharmacy. Say they're for an infected cut." "Ellie!" Thor grabbed her wrist with his good hand. "It's over. We have to run. Canada, maybe. Mexico. Somewhere they can't find us." "No!" She pulled away. "We're so close. 6 subjects. The collection is almost complete. We just need— Listen to yourself." Thor's voice rose, then cracked with pain. "I'm shot. We nearly got killed. The police are actively hunting us. It's over." Elowen stared at him, then at their collection. All those photographs, all those carefully preserved memories, all that meaning they'd constructed from death. "It can't be over," she whispered. "This is all we have. Without this, we're nothing. Nobody." Thor saw it then, the depths of her pathology, the void at her center that no amount of killing could fill. She wasn't preserving the forgotten. She was trying to preserve herself, to create meaning in a universe she saw as fundamentally meaningless. "We're already nobody," Thor said quietly. "We always were. That's why we did this." Elowen slapped him again, harder this time. "Shut up. Just shut up." She grabbed the medical kit and her jacket. "I'm going to Mitchell for supplies. You rest. When I come back, we'll decide what to do." "Ellie, don't!" But she was already gone, starting the van, leaving him alone in the darkness with their collection of dead faces watching from the walls. She drove to Mitchell in a daze, not thinking clearly, running on adrenaline and desperation. She parked behind the general store at 2 a.m., waiting for dawn when she could buy supplies without drawing attention. At 6:30, when the store opened, she went in wearing sunglasses to hide her distinctive eyes. The clerk, a teenage boy barely awake, barely looked at her as she purchased sulfa powder, bandages, rubbing alcohol, and canned food. "Camping?" the boy asked, making obligatory conversation. "Yes. My husband cut himself badly on equipment. Nothing serious, but we need to treat it." The boy nodded, disinterested, taking her money. She left, feeling like she'd dodged a bullet. What she didn't see was Sheriff Dowsett's patrol car parked across the street, or Dowsett himself in the diner having breakfast and interviewing locals. And she didn't see Deputy Thatcher notice her van, beige, Ford panel, California plates, pulling away from the store. "Sheriff!" Thatcher ran across the street. "That's them! That's the van!" Dowsett dropped his coffee and ran for his vehicle. By the time he pulled onto the street, the van was disappearing around a curve, heading east toward the forest. "We've got them," Dowsett said, grabbing his radio. "All units, suspect vehicle spotted heading east on Forest Road 42. In pursuit. Request backup immediately." The chase had begun, and in the forest, Thor Crawford lay bleeding in the van, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes, waiting for his wife to return, and wondering if he'd live long enough to face justice, or if the desert would claim him first, making him just another forgotten soul in the collection of the dead. Elowen saw the patrol car in her rearview mirror and felt ice crystallize in her veins. She pressed the accelerator, the van's engine straining as she took the curve too fast, gravel spraying from beneath the tires. Behind her, Sheriff Dowsett's Ford gained ground, siren wailing across the empty morning landscape. "Stop the vehicle!" Dowsett's voice crackled over his loudspeaker. "Pull over now!" Elowen's mind raced. Thor was wounded, possibly dying. Their collection was in the van, evidence of everything. If they were caught now, it was over. Not just arrest, but the death penalty. Oregon still executed murderers, still used the gas chamber or electric chair. She'd read about it, almost academically, never imagining it would apply to her. She yanked the wheel left, taking a logging road that shot into the forest like an arrow. The van bounced violently over ruts and rocks. Behind her, Dowsett followed, his patrol car better suited to the terrain, but hampered by the narrow road and her desperation. In the back of the van, Thor groaned as his wounded shoulder slammed against the wall. "Ellie, stop! You'll kill us both!" She didn't answer, didn't slow down. Trees blurred past. The road deteriorated into little more than a track, branches scraping the van's sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. Deputy Thatcher's voice came over Dowsett's radio. "Sheriff, I'm 5 minutes behind you. State police are mobilizing. Roadblocks being set up on all major routes out of the forest." "Stay with me, Thatcher. Subject is heading deeper into national forest land. She knows the territory." Dowsett had a sudden realization. They'd been burying their victims in this forest. They knew the back roads, the hidden clearings. They had advantages here that he didn't. Ahead, Elowen took another turn. This one so sharp, the van tilted on 2 wheels before slamming back down. She was heading for their burial site, the clearing where Thor waited, where they'd hidden Corbett Rush's body. It was remote, difficult to access. If she could reach it, maybe they could hide in the dense forest until dark, then escape on foot. But the van was leaving a clear trail of dust and disturbed earth, and more vehicles were coming. She could hear additional sirens now, converging from multiple directions. The clearing appeared suddenly, a roughly circular space surrounded by dense pine and juniper. Elowen slammed the brakes, the van skidding sideways, coming to rest 20 feet from where they'd buried Corbett 18 months ago. She ran to the back, throwing open the doors. Thor lay pale and sweating, his bandage soaked through with fresh blood. "We have to run," she gasped. "Now, into the forest." "I can't." Thor's voice was weak. "Lost too much blood. Can barely stand." "Then I'll help you. We can hide. Wait them out. Ellie." He grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "It's over. Let them take us." "No!" She pulled away, looking wildly around the clearing. "I won't let them destroy everything we've built. The collection, our purpose, everything that makes us matter." "We don't matter," Thor shouted, finding strength in desperation. "We never did. That's the whole goddamn point. We're just 2 sick people who killed innocent people and told ourselves lies to justify it." Elowen stared at him as if he'd struck her. Then she heard the engines, multiple vehicles now, closing in. She ran to the front of the van and grabbed the pistol from the glove compartment. The one they'd taken from Delmar Hatch, loaded with 5 rounds. 3 had been fired at Evander. 2 remained. "What are you doing?" Thor struggled to sit up. "They can't have the collection," Elowen said, her voice eerily calm. "They can't destroy our work. I won't let them." She raised the pistol, aiming at the shrine built into the van's wall, the photographs, the trophies, the carefully preserved evidence of 6 murders. "Ellie, don't!" she fired. The bullet punched through Oswald Grunberg's photograph, through Inata Silverstone's woven bracelet, destroying months of careful preservation. Then Sheriff Dowsett's patrol car burst into the clearing, followed seconds later by Deputy Thatcher's vehicle. Both men emerged with weapons drawn. "Drop the gun," Dowsett commanded. "Hands where I can see them." Elowen turned toward them, the pistol now pointing in their direction. Not aiming exactly, but not lowered either. Her face was streaked with tears, her expression that of someone watching their entire world collapse. "You don't understand," she said. "They were nobody. Forgotten. We gave them meaning. We remembered them." "You murdered them," Dowsett said quietly, moving slowly to his left, trying to get a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting Thor in the van. "You took their lives. That's not preservation. That's destruction." "No!" Elowen's voice rose. "We saved them from oblivion. Without us, they would have died alone and been forgotten within a generation. Now they're immortal. Now they matter." "They mattered before you killed them," Thatcher said from her right, also moving, creating crossfire angles. "They mattered to themselves. That was enough." More vehicles were arriving. State police, additional deputies. the clearing filled with armed men, all focused on the slight woman holding a pistol with one round left. Thor crawled to the van's open doors. "Ellie, please, put it down. It's over." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. The man who'd shared her vision, who'd understood her philosophy, who'd helped her build something meaningful from meaningless deaths. That man was gone, replaced by someone who'd lost faith. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry you can't see it anymore." She raised the pistol to her own temple. "No!" Multiple voices shouted simultaneously. Dowsett fired. His bullet hit Elowen's shoulder, the same side Thor had been shot. The impact spun her around, the pistol flying from her grip. She collapsed, gasping in pain and shock. Deputies rushed forward, kicking the weapon away, securing her hands with cuffs, even as she screamed. Not in pain, but in anguish at the failure of everything she'd believed in. Medics arrived minutes later. They stabilized both Thor and Elowen, bandaging wounds, starting IVs. As they loaded Elowen onto a stretcher, she stared back at the van, at the shrine she'd built, now partially destroyed by her own hand. "The photographs," she murmured deliriously. "We have to save the photographs." "Ma'am, you need to stay still," the medic said. "They'll be forgotten," she whispered. "Without us, they'll all be forgotten." Dowsett approached the van cautiously, Thatcher at his side. The interior was unlike anything he'd expected. The hidden panel in the wall had swung open from the bullet's impact, revealing the shrine. 6 photographs, mounted with care. 6 sets of personal items, watches, jewelry, tools, each tagged with a name and date. Oswald Grunberg, Inata Silverstone, Delmar Hatch. Vivian McQuaid's photograph was there too, though she'd survived. Corbett Rush. And a 6th space, empty, waiting. "Jesus Christ," Thatcher breathed. "They kept trophies." Dowsett examined the shrine with professional detachment, though his stomach churned. Not just trophies. They built a memorial. They actually believed they were honoring these people. He found Elowen's journal in a locked box beneath the shrine. Page after page of meticulous notes, victim profiles, philosophical justifications, burial coordinates. The coordinates were precise, marked on hand-drawn maps. "Get forensics teams mobilized," Dowsett said. "We're going to need cadaver dogs, excavation equipment, and a lot of manpower. We've got multiple burial sites to locate." Over the next 2 days, working from Elowen's maps, they found the graves. Oswald Grunberg, 15 miles northeast of Milton Freewater, his skeletal remains still wrapped in the tarp the Crawfords had used. The gold pocket watch confirmed his identity. Inata Silverstone, in an aspen grove above Joseph, her bones intertwined with roots that had grown through her remains. The silver bracelet was missing, in the Crawfords' collection, but dental records confirmed her identity. Delmar Hatch, in the Malheur National Forest, his carpenter's plane buried beside him like a pharaoh's tool for the afterlife. Corbett Rush, the deepest grave, in the Ochoko National Forest. His ranger badge had been taken, but his belt buckle, engraved with his name, remained. 4 bodies recovered. 4 murders confirmed. Plus the attempted murder of Evander Talius. And Vivian McQuaid's near suicide, which prosecutors would argue was a result of psychological manipulation. The evidence was overwhelming. The shrine, the journal, the burial maps, the victims' personal effects, and most damning of all, the photographs. Thor had documented everything, creating a visual record of their crimes. In the hospital, under guard, Thor Crawford made a full confession. He detailed every murder, every decision, every burial. His cooperation was total, his remorse seemingly genuine. "She believed it," he told Detective Kimball during the recorded interview. "The philosophy about preservation, about saving people from oblivion. I don't know if I ever truly believed it, or if I just wanted to believe in something. Either way, We killed innocent people, and no philosophy can justify that. Elowen refused to speak. She sat in her hospital bed, staring at the wall, occasionally murmuring about the collection, about memory, about the forgotten souls. A psychiatric evaluation would later determine she was fit to stand trial despite her delusional belief system. By December 15, 1963, both Thor and Elowen Crawford were formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and multiple counts of kidnapping, assault, and desecration of human remains. The trial was set for spring 1964 in Bend, Oregon. The prosecution was seeking the death penalty for both defendants. Sheriff Mervyn Dowsett returned to his office in Fossil and stared at the map on his wall, at the red pins marking where 5 people had died, or nearly died. He'd caught the killers, recovered the bodies, brought closure to families. But he couldn't shake the image of that shrine, of the care with which the Crawfords had preserved their victims' memories, even as they'd stolen their lives. They really believed they were doing something meaningful, he said to Thatcher. Does that make it better or worse? Thatcher asked. Dowsett thought about it. Worse. Much worse. Because they stole not just lives, but the victims' own narratives. They made them into objects in a collection instead of letting them be what they were, people who mattered on their own terms. The Crawfords had tried to conquer oblivion by becoming its agents. They'd failed, and now they would face their own reckoning. Justice, delayed but not denied, was finally coming. The winter of 1963–64 was brutal in eastern Oregon. Snow came early and heavy, blanketing the forests where the Crawfords had buried their victims. But the investigation couldn't wait for spring. Families needed closure. The prosecution needed evidence. And Sheriff Dowsett needed to ensure no other bodies remained hidden in the vast wilderness. The forensics team worked in conditions that tested human endurance. Dr. Helena Voss, the state medical examiner, supervised the exhumations personally. A severe woman of 50 with 30 years of experience, she'd seen her share of horror, but the Crawford case affected her differently. They buried them with care, she told Dowsett at the Oswald Grunberg site, watching her team carefully excavate the remains. Proper depth, quicklime to accelerate decomposition and reduce smell. They even oriented the bodies north-south, like proper graves. These weren't just disposal sites, they were reverently done. Does that matter legally? Dowsett asked. Not for prosecution, but it matters for understanding who these people are. Most serial killers treat victims like trash. The Crawfords treated them like sacred relics. She paused, brushing snow from a fragment of bone. It's pathological reverence, but reverence nonetheless. Each excavation yielded more than just remains. At Inata Silverstone's grave, they found scraps of the woven blankets she'd been wrapped in, textiles the Crawfords must have taken from her cabin before burning it. At Delmar Hatch's site, they discovered woodworking tools buried alongside him, items not mentioned in Elowen's journal but clearly placed there intentionally. They were building tombs, Thatcher observed, not just hiding bodies. The most disturbing discovery came at Corbett Roosh's grave. Buried with him was a folded American flag, his Ranger service flag, and a handwritten note in Elowen's distinctive script. Corbett Roosh, 1902–1961. Ranger, widower, survivor. You served your country and the wilderness. We serve your memory. You will not be forgotten. Dr. Voss photographed the note with trembling hands. This is evidence of their delusion. They genuinely believed they were honoring these people. By murdering them? Dowsett said flatly. Yes, the ultimate contradiction. The physical evidence mounted steadily. The Oregon State Crime Lab processed everything from the van. Fingerprints matching the victims on personal items in the shrine. Traces of secobarbital in the coffee thermoses. Fibers from the tarps matching fibers found with the remains, and, most crucially, photographs. Thor's camera had documented everything. Beyond the formal portraits displayed in the shrine, they found hundreds of additional images. Victims alive and smiling during interviews, crime scenes, burial sites, even photographs of the Crawfords themselves standing beside graves, expressions ranging from solemn to ecstatic. Detective Roy Kimball spread the photographs across a conference table in the prosecutor's office. District Attorney Marcus Ellsworth, a hawk-faced man of 43 with a reputation for obtaining death penalties, studied them with cold satisfaction. "This is overwhelming evidence of premeditation, planning, and lack of remorse," Ellsworth said. "The defense will try to argue insanity, but these photographs show rational planning over years. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They hid it, traveled between jurisdictions, created false identities. That's consciousness of guilt." "What about Elowen Crawford's psychiatric evaluation?" Kimball asked. Ellsworth consulted the report. Dr. Brennan diagnosed her with narcissistic personality disorder with delusional features. She believes she's preserving cultural memory, saving people from meaninglessness. But, and this is crucial, she understands that society views her actions as criminal. She simply believes society is wrong. So she's not legally insane? Correct. She knows right from wrong by legal standards. She just disagrees with those standards. That's not insanity. That's ideology. And Thor Crawford? His evaluation is more interesting. Dr. Brennan believes Thor never fully embraced the philosophy. He went along with it because he was in love with Elowen, and because it gave his own emptiness purpose. He's deeply remorseful now, cooperating fully, but remorse doesn't negate culpability. Ellsworth tapped the photographs. "We're seeking death penalty for both. 4 proven murders, 1 attempted murder. Clear premeditation. No mitigating factors that justify mercy." While prosecutors built their case, defense attorneys scrambled to find any grounds for mitigation. Thor's attorney, Martin Kellerman, a Portland public defender overwhelmed by the case's magnitude, argued that his client's cooperation and remorse should count for something. "He's provided complete testimony," Kellerman told the preliminary hearing judge. "Without his confession and the detailed information in Mrs. Crawford's journal, we might never have recovered all the bodies. That cooperation demonstrates genuine remorse. It demonstrates an understanding that he was caught," Ellsworth countered. "Mr. Crawford cooperated because he had no choice. The evidence was overwhelming. His remorse is self-serving." Elowen's attorney, Sarah Drucker, faced an even more difficult task. Drucker was a Seattle criminal defense attorney with experience in complex cases, hired by Elowen's estranged parents, wealthy Portland socialites who disowned their daughter years ago but couldn't bear the shame of her dying without representation. Drucker's strategy was to humanize Elowen, to show the jury that beneath the monster was a deeply damaged woman whose philosophical delusions had consumed her. "My client suffered childhood trauma," Drucker argued at a pre-trial motion. "Emotional neglect, psychological abuse. She developed a worldview in which human life lacked inherent meaning. Her crimes, while horrific, stem from genuine mental illness." "She understood her actions were illegal," Ellsworth shot back. "She took elaborate precautions to avoid detection. That's not mental illness. That's criminal cunning." Judge Harlan Westfield, a stern man of 60 with no patience for legal theatrics, ruled that both defendants were competent to stand trial. The psychiatric evaluations would be admissible, but wouldn't constitute an insanity defense. The trial was set for April 13, 1964. As spring arrived, the national media descended on Bend, Oregon. The Crawford case had captured public imagination in a way few crimes did. The New York Times called them the Philosopher Killers. Life magazine ran a feature titled "The Collection of Death: How two twisted intellectuals murdered to conquer oblivion. The victims' families, what few relatives could be found, gave interviews expressing grief and rage. Oswald Grunberg's distant cousin in Hamburg spoke about how Oswald had fled Nazi Germany seeking freedom, only to be murdered by American psychopaths. Inata Silverstone's daughter, who'd been estranged from her mother, wept on camera about guilt and lost opportunities for reconciliation. Delmar Hatch had no living family, which somehow made his death more poignant. He'd been exactly what the Crawfords claimed to be saving, a forgotten soul. But he hadn't needed saving. He'd needed to be left alone to live his life on his own terms. Corbett Rush's fellow Rangers held a memorial service at Crater Lake. They placed a plaque on an overlook he'd loved. Corbett Rush, 1902 to 1961. He protected the wilderness. The wilderness could not protect him. Vivian McQuaid, the survivor, gave a single interview to the Oregonian. She looked healthier than she had in years, having finally left Fossil and moved to Eugene, where she worked at the university library. "They made me feel valued," she said quietly. "Like my life mattered. That's what makes it so horrible. They understood loneliness intimately enough to exploit it perfectly. And when they left, taking that validation with them, I wanted to die. They didn't just almost kill me. They made me want to kill myself. That's a special kind of evil." Evander Tullius also spoke to reporters, showing the Purple Heart he'd earned in Korea. "I survived 2 years of combat. Came home to find worse monsters here than anything I faced overseas. At least the enemy in Korea was honest about wanting to kill you." In separate cells at the Deschutes County Jail, the Crawfords awaited trial. They were kept apart, both for security and to prevent them from coordinating their testimonies, though Thor had already confessed to everything. Thor spent his time reading philosophy, Camus, Sartre, Kierkegaard, trying to understand how he'd fallen so far from the person he'd thought he was. He wrote long letters to his attorney, analyzing his own psychology with brutal honesty. "I was empty," one letter read, "not evil, just empty. Ellie gave me purpose, made me feel like I mattered. I thought we were creating meaning from meaninglessness, but we were just creating death. There's no philosophy that justifies what we did. We murdered innocent people, and we did it for the most selfish reason possible, to make ourselves feel important." Elowen, by contrast, remained defiant. She refused most visitors, spent her time writing in a new journal provided by her attorney. In it, she continued developing her philosophy, arguing that society's condemnation proved it didn't understand the deeper truth she'd grasped. "They think we're monsters," she wrote. "They can't see that we were the only ones who truly cared about these forgotten souls. History will vindicate us. Future philosophers will understand what we were attempting. The conquest of oblivion through preservation of memory. We failed not in our mission, but in our execution. We should have hidden better, worked longer, built a larger collection. Then they would have understood." Dr. Brennan, reading these journal entries as part of ongoing psychiatric evaluation, found them chilling. She's completely unrepentant. She's reframed her capture not as justice, but as martyrdom for a cause she still believes is righteous. If released, she would kill again without hesitation. This evaluation would prove crucial at trial. On April 12, 1964, the evening before the trial began, Sheriff Dowsett visited the evidence room where the Crawfords' collection was stored. He looked at the photographs, the trophies, the journal entries. He thought about the 4 people buried in the forest, about Vivian McQuaid's attempted suicide, about Evander Tullius's close call. "You wanted to be remembered," he said quietly to the photographs of Thor and Elowen. "You wanted to matter. Well, you'll be remembered, but not the way you hoped." Tomorrow, justice would begin its slow, methodical process, and by the time it finished, the Crawfords would discover that sometimes the only thing worse than being forgotten is being remembered for exactly what you are. The Deschutes County Courthouse in Bend, Oregon, had never seen anything like the Crawford trial. By dawn on April 13, 1964, hundreds of spectators lined the streets, some having driven from as far as California and Washington. News crews from 3 major networks set up cameras. Inside, every seat in the gallery was filled, with overflow crowds listening via radio in adjacent rooms. Judge Harlan Westfield gavelled the proceedings to order at 9 a.m. sharp. Thor and Elowen Crawford sat at separate defense tables, 15 feet apart, but worlds away in demeanor. Thor looked haggard, his shoulders still bandaged, his face carrying the weight of genuine remorse. Elowen sat ramrod straight, her pale green eyes scanning the courtroom with clinical detachment, as if observing an interesting sociological experiment rather than her own murder trial. District Attorney Marcus Ellsworth rose for his opening statement, his voice measured and grave. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next 3 weeks, you will hear evidence of crimes so calculated, so cold-blooded, that they challenge our understanding of human nature. The defendants, Thor and Elowen Crawford, systematically hunted, murdered, and buried 4 innocent people. They didn't kill for money, or passion, or revenge. They killed because they viewed human beings as objects to be collected, specimens for their grotesque gallery of death. He walked to a display board covered with a sheet. The prosecution will show you this. He pulled the sheet away, revealing blown-up photographs from the Crawfords' shrine. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. This is how the defendants memorialized their victims. Photographs, personal items stolen from the dead, journal entries describing each murder in meticulous detail. They called it preservation. We call it what it is: premeditated, first-degree murder. Ellsworth methodically outlined the evidence: the bodies, the burial sites, the journal, the confessions, the testimony of survivors. When we're finished, you will have no doubt. These defendants are guilty, and they deserve the ultimate punishment our law allows. Martin Kellerman, Thor's attorney, rose reluctantly. He was outmatched and knew it. My client doesn't contest the facts. He committed these terrible acts, but he asks you to consider his complete cooperation, his genuine remorse, his willingness to help families find closure. Thor Crawford is a broken man who made monstrous choices, but he's trying, in whatever small way possible, to atone. It was a weak opening, and everyone knew it. Remorse, after being caught, carried little weight. Sarah Drucker, Elowen's attorney, took a different approach. My client suffers from severe mental illness. The psychiatric evidence will show that Elowen Crawford genuinely believed she was preserving these people, honoring them, saving them from being forgotten. Her actions were horrific, yes, but they stemmed from a delusional worldview shaped by childhood trauma and untreated psychological disorders. She is sick, not evil, and while that doesn't excuse her crimes, it should inform how we respond to them. Elowen shifted slightly, her jaw tightening. She didn't want to be portrayed as mentally ill. She wanted to be understood as a philosopher, a visionary. But her attorney had made the strategic calculation that sympathy was the only path away from the death penalty. The prosecution's case unfolded with devastating precision. Dr. Helena Voss testified about the exhumations, describing each victim's remains and cause of death. Jurors grew pale as she displayed photographs of skeletal hands still bound with rope, of skulls showing fractures consistent with strangulation. In my 30 years as a medical examiner, Dr. Voss said, I've never seen such a combination of violence and care. They killed brutally, then buried respectfully. It's deeply disturbing. Sheriff Dowsett walked the jury through the investigation, explaining how patterns had emerged, how the net had slowly tightened. He read excerpts from Elowen's journal, his voice steady, but his face showing strain. Subject 3. Delmar Hatch. He wept when we told him his work mattered. In that moment, I knew we'd given him more meaning than his entire life had contained. His gratitude made the necessary conclusion easier. We are not murderers. We are curators of forgotten souls. Several jurors looked nauseated. One woman dabbed tears from her eyes. Evander Tullius testified about the attempted attack, his military bearing evident despite obvious emotional trauma. They came to kill me. No doubt about it. If I hadn't been armed and alert, I'd be buried in those woods too. Vivian McQuaid's testimony was perhaps most devastating. She described the Crawfords' kindness, their apparent genuine interest in her life, the hope they'd kindled in her desperately lonely existence. When they left, she said quietly, I felt like I'd lost the only people who'd ever truly seen me. That's how good they were at manipulation. They made me believe they cared. And when that validation disappeared, I wanted to die. She looked directly at Elowen. You didn't try to kill me with poison or rope. You tried to kill me with hope, then took it away. That's cruelty at its purest. Elowen stared back, unflinching, and for just a moment her mask slipped. A flash of something. Guilt? Recognition? Crossed her face before the cold detachment returned. The defense's case was brief. Dr. Brennan testified about Elowen's psychological profile, describing her narcissistic personality disorder, her delusional belief system, her childhood trauma. She's not legally insane, but she is profoundly ill. Her crimes stem from a fundamentally distorted view of reality and human value. On cross-examination, Ellsworth destroyed this sympathy with surgical precision. Dr. Brennan, did Mrs. Crawford understand that murder was illegal? Yes, but did she take steps to avoid detection? Yes, however. Did she understand that her victims would die? Of course, but you must understand. I understand perfectly, doctor. Your patient knew she was committing crimes. She planned carefully to avoid being caught. She understood the permanence of death. That's not delusion. That's criminal intent. Thor took the stand in his own defense, against his attorney's advice. Pale and shaking, he recounted the entire story. Meeting Elowen, developing their philosophy, the first murder, the descent into serial killing. I can't explain how I convinced myself it was acceptable, he said, his voice breaking. I loved Ellie. She made me feel like I mattered, like we were doing important work. But there's no philosophy that justifies murder. I killed 4 people. I helped bury them. I took their lives for the most selfish reason imaginable. To fill the emptiness inside myself. I deserve whatever punishment this court decides. Under cross-examination, he didn't defend himself. He simply agreed with every accusation Ellsworth made. Elowen chose not to testify. Her attorney advised against it, knowing her lack of remorse would seal her fate. She sat silently through the entire trial, occasionally taking notes, her face a mask of cold observation. Closing arguments came in early May. Ellsworth's was brief and brutal. 4 murders, overwhelming evidence, premeditation, no justification, no excuse. Justice demands the ultimate penalty. Kellerman made an emotional plea for Thor's life. My client is guilty. He knows it. He's cooperated completely. He's shown genuine remorse. Executing him won't bring back the victims. Life imprisonment will ensure he never harms anyone again. I beg you to show the mercy he failed to show his victims. Drucker made a similar plea for Elowen, emphasizing mental illness and childhood trauma. But her client's cold demeanor throughout the trial had undermined any sympathy the jury might have felt. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. On May 8, 1964, they returned with their verdict. In the case of Thorvald Crawford, on the charge of first-degree murder of Oswald Grunberg. How do you find? Guilty. The same verdict came for each victim. Inada Silverstone, Delmar Hatch, Corbett Rush. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Plus guilty on the attempted murder of Evander Tullius. In the case of Elowen Crawford, the same litany. Guilty on all counts. Judge Westfield moved immediately to sentencing. Oregon law required a separate penalty phase, but the jury's recommendation came swiftly. Death for both defendants on all murder counts. On May 15, 1964, Judge Westfield formally sentenced Thor and Elowen Crawford to death by execution. Oregon offered a choice: gas chamber or electric chair. Both chose the electric chair, scheduled for October 23, 1964. Appeals were automatic and swift. Both defendants' attorneys filed with the Oregon Supreme Court, arguing various technical points. The appeals were denied within 4 months. Federal appeals were similarly unsuccessful. On October 22, 1964, the night before their executions, the Crawfords were allowed a final meeting. They sat across from each other in a conference room, guards watching through windows. They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Thor spoke. "I'm sorry, Ellie, for everything. For enabling you, for not stopping you, for being too weak to walk away." Elowen's face remained impassive. "You've lost faith in our purpose." "There was no purpose, just killing, just death." "No," she said firmly. "We gave them meaning. We preserved them. History will remember us as murderers," Thor interrupted. "That's all we are. That's all we'll ever be." Elowen stood abruptly. "I don't accept that. I won't accept that our work was meaningless. Accept it or don't. Tomorrow we die. And eventually, we'll be forgotten too. That's the real irony, isn't it? We tried to conquer oblivion by killing people. But oblivion always wins." Elowen stared at him, and for the first time since their arrest, tears filled her eyes. Not tears of remorse for her victims, but tears of existential terror. The realization that Thor might be right, that their entire philosophy had been a lie they'd told themselves to justify the unjustifiable. "I don't want to be forgotten," she whispered. "Then you shouldn't have become a monster," Thor said quietly. October 23, 1964, dawned cold and clear. At the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, preparations for the double execution proceeded with grim efficiency. Thor Crawford was scheduled for 10 a.m., Elowen for 11 a.m. Thor walked to the electric chair with quiet dignity. His last words were simple: "I'm sorry. To the families, to the victims, I'm sorry." The execution took 4 minutes. Thor Crawford, age 39, was pronounced dead at 10:04 a.m. Elowen walked to the chair an hour later. She showed no fear, no remorse. Her last words were chilling. "You think you've won. You think justice has been served. But I preserved them. I made them immortal. And someday, someone will understand." The executioner threw the switch. Elowen Crawford, age 36, was pronounced dead at 11:06 a.m. Their bodies were cremated. No family claimed the ashes. They were eventually scattered in an unmarked location, their final resting place unknown and unrecorded. The Crawfords' collection, the photographs, the trophies, the journal, was placed in sealed evidence storage, where it remains to this day. Some items were returned to victims' families. Others were destroyed at their request. Sheriff Mervyn Dowsett retired in 1970, never quite recovering from the Crawford case. He died in 1983, having spent his final years advocating for better mental health services in rural communities. The victims' families slowly healed. Graves were established in proper cemeteries. Memorials were erected. The forgotten souls the Crawfords claimed to be saving were finally, truly honored. Not as objects in a collection, but as human beings whose lives had mattered on their own terms. Vivian McQuaid remarried in 1967 and lived until 2003. She rarely spoke of the Crawfords, but once told an interviewer, "They wanted to be remembered. I hope they're completely forgotten. That would be fitting justice." In the end, she got her wish. The Crawford case faded from public memory. True crime historians occasionally mention it, but it lacks the notoriety of other serial killers. Thor and Elowen Crawford wanted immortality, wanted to conquer oblivion. Instead, they achieved exactly what they'd tried to prevent. They were forgotten. Their victims, Oswald, Inata, Delmar, and Corbett, were remembered by those who loved them, honored in quiet ways that the Crawfords never could have understood. And perhaps that's the final irony. The Crawfords believed meaning had to be imposed, preserved, curated. But meaning simply exists in the living of a life, in the connections we make, in the quiet dignity of being human. They killed to create meaning, and in doing so, they destroyed the only meaning that ever mattered, the inherent value of a human life, lived on its own terms, remembered by those who genuinely loved and cared. The collectors of oblivion had themselves been claimed by it, and the world, mercifully, moved on.